Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're jumping into a topic that, well, feels fundamental, but is actually surprisingly complex. The world of countries and the intricate dynamics of international aid.
Absolutely. It seems simple on the surface.
Right. We've got a stack of sources here, including excerpts from countries and the dynamics of international aid. And our goal is really to navigate all this material together. We want to pull out the crucial insights, maybe some surprising facts, just to give you a clear understanding without, getting lost in the weeds.
Sounds like a good plan. Where should we start?
Let's kick things off with something that seems simple, but our sources show us it's not. How many countries are there in the world?
That's a perfect starting point because even that basic count reveals some of the complexity we'll get into. Based on the sources, the most widely accepted number, especially right now, May 29th, 2025, is 193.
Okay, 193.
And that count specifically refers to full member states of the United Nations. South Sudan, which joined back in 2011, is the newest one on that list.
Okay, 193 UN members. But you said it's not straightforward. So why do we sometimes hear different numbers, like 195, maybe 197?
Yeah, that's where the politics of recognition really comes into play. The 193 number is solid. It's based on the UN's official list. The variation comes from entities that, they function like states. They might have some international recognition, but they aren't full UN members.
Like who?
Well, for example, Taiwan is recognized by, I think, 13 other countries. Kosovo has recognition from around 100 countries. And Palestine is recognized by 138 UN members, which is significant, but it's still not universal recognition.
Right. So those other counts, the 195 or 197, they might be including entities like Taiwan or Kosovo, maybe even though, it's a UN observer state, not a full member.
Exactly. Including those partially recognized states or observer states, that's what pushes the number up. And that's why the 193 count, based purely on UN membership, is often seen as the most, let's say, neutral starting point in a politically charged landscape.
Makes sense. And then we have territories or dependencies, places like Hong Kong or Puerto Rico. They don't count as sovereign countries in this list at all.
Correct. The sources remind us that places like Hong Kong, Puerto Rico, Greenland, they're considered dependencies or disputed territories. They aren't independent sovereign countries for this count. So sticking to that UN list gives us the clear, consistent 193.
Okay, that really lays the groundwork for understanding how we even, define a country. Let's shift gears now and unpack the history of international aid. Our sources dig into this quite a bit. What's the basic definition they're using for aid?
Yeah, so international aid, or you might hear foreign aid, it's defined in the material as the transfer of resources. That could be money, goods, services, even technical expertise, moving from one country or an international organization to another.
And the purpose?
The typical goals are framed around development, humanitarian needs, or sometimes broader strategic objectives.
And looking at the history, aid isn't like a totally new idea, but its purpose and scale. They've really changed over time, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. If you go way back, say, to the colonial era, European powers like Britain and France were sending resources to their colonies. But let's be clear, this wasn't aid like we think of it now. It was mostly about administering those territories, exploiting resources. Aid as a tool of control, really.
Very different. What about the 19th century? Was there much aid then?
It was pretty limited, often tied to missionary work or maybe responding to specific disasters. The sources mention British aid during the famines in India in the 1800s as an early, large-scale relief example, but it wasn't systematic, planned international development.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, according to the sources. The formalization, the massive expansion of aid that happens after World War II. Why was that such a pivotal moment?
That's when aid fundamentally transforms into a major geopolitical tool, the Marshall Plan, right? 1948 to 1952. That's the prime example. The U.S. pumped $13 billion, which, is over $100 billion in today's money, into rebuilding Western Europe.
Wow. And that wasn't just generosity.
No, definitely not just generosity. It was a huge strategic move. It was designed to stabilize those war-torn economies, make them less vulnerable to Soviet influence, and, frankly, build strong trading partners for the U.S.
So aid immediately got tangled up with the emerging Cold War.
Precisely. Throughout the Cold War, 1945 to 1991, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union explicitly used aid to build alliances, expand their spheres of influence. You see the U.S. pouring billions into supporting regimes like South Vietnam, while the Soviets backed allies like Cuba with aid. It became a competitive chess piece, essentially.
And the decolonization wave in the mid-20th century, that played into this too.
It did. As former colonies became independent nations, powers like the UK and France often kept providing aid. Again, not purely altruistic. It was often a way to maintain economic links, political influence in these new countries.
It seems like the focus shifted a bit later on, maybe towards more humanitarian crises.
Yeah, that's true. Starting in the late 20th century, you see a noticeable growth in aid aimed at global health problems like HIV/AIDS, but also famines, natural disasters. Programs like PEPFAR, the U.S. President's emergency plan for AIDS relief that funneled billions into health systems, especially in Africa, are a good example of this growing humanitarian focus.
So the modern era of aid, say, since the 2000s, it's really a mix of all these historical drivers coming together.
Exactly. Today, international aid is this big umbrella. It includes ODA, official development assistance for long-term development, it includes humanitarian aid for emergencies, and it includes military aid. Trillions have been dispersed globally just since 2000. And the players are governments plus big international organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and various UN agencies, UNICEF, WHO, and so on.
And looking back at this whole history, one thing that jumps out immediately is that aid is rarely, if ever, just about pure altruism.
That's a key insight from the sources, definitely. While humanitarian needs are absolutely real and a genuine driver for some aid, the history strongly suggests that most large-scale aid programs have been significantly driven by the strategic, economic, or security interests of the donor. Humanitarian concerns have become more prominent, yes, but they exist alongside those other powerful motives.
Okay, so that brings us to today. Who are the major donors now, and what are their main reasons for giving aid in this complex global environment?
Well, today's aid landscape has sort of three main categories of donors. You've got national governments, you've got the big international organizations we mentioned, and you also have non-governmental organizations, NGOs.
And among the government donors, the sources highlight the United States as still being the biggest.
Yes, in terms of sheer volume, the U.S. is still the leader. We're talking over $100 billion annually in recent years. A very concrete example the sources give is the over $100 billion directed to Ukraine since 2022.
And the U.S. motives are mixed.
Very mixed, yes. National security is huge. You see that clearly with the Ukraine aid aimed at countering Russia, but also economic influence and definitely significant humanitarian goals like disaster relief and global health funding.
And what about Europe? European countries are also major players, right? Often working together through the EU.
That's right. Big European donors like Germany, France, the UK, they give aid bilaterally, country to country, but also coordinate a lot through EU programs. Their reasons often include promoting stability in nearby regions, managing migration flows that affect Europe, and maintaining those historical ties and influence, especially in former colonies.
In China. China's emerged as a really different kind of major donor, hasn't it? Especially with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, China's approach is quite distinct. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, it provides billions, often as loans, but also grants mainly to countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America. China's motives seem heavily focused on securing access to vital resources, opening up new markets for its own goods, and building diplomatic relationships to gain leverage on the world stage.
We also see significant aid coming from countries like Japan and South Korea.
Yes, their aid tends to focus heavily on regional partners in Asia, but also Africa. They often prioritize economic partnerships and boosting their regional influence.
And then there are others, like Canada, Australia, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway.
Right. Those donors often put a very strong emphasis on humanitarian aid, supporting human rights, and funding sustainable development goals around the world. They have a reputation for that kind of focus.
So if we try to sum up the motives across all these different donors, what are the key drivers that the sources keep pointing to?
The sources list several recurring motivations. Strategic interests are definitely paramount, using aid to get military base access, maybe secure diplomatic support in places like the UN, or countering rival powers. Economic benefits are crucial. That could be opening markets for the donor country's exports, or ensuring access to resources like minerals or oil. Humanitarian goals are also significant, aimed at poverty, disaster relief, health crises like pandemics. Soft power comes into it too, using aid to boost a country's global image. And finally, security. A big driver is using aid to try and stabilize fragile states, hoping to prevent problems like terrorism, major conflict, or uncontrolled migration from spilling over.
And what benefits do these donors actually expect to get back from giving all this aid?
Well, beyond achieving those specific goals, donors generally anticipate broader benefits, things like increased geopolitical influence, potential economic returns, especially if the aid is tied, meaning the recipient has to buy goods from the donor country.
All right.
Also, enhanced global stability, which reduces risks for everyone, including the donor, and, bolstering their image as responsible global actors, moral leadership.
It's really fascinating how deeply aid is woven into global alliances and these strategic support networks. It's clearly not just random charity.
Absolutely not. Where aid goes is a fundamental part of how countries build and maintain their alliances. It's a key piece of the puzzle.
Like how the U.S. uses aid within its own Western alliances.
Exactly. The U.S. provides huge amounts of aid to core NATO allies and also to key strategic partners like Israel and Egypt. And that's staggering $100 billion plus to Ukraine since 2022. That's a crystal clear, very recent example of using aid to bolster NATO's eastern flank and directly push back against Russian and arguably Chinese influence in that region.
And the EU countries do something similar.
Yeah, EU countries often coordinate their aid, frequently targeting Africa and the Middle East. Part of the motivation there is definitely driven by concerns closer to home managing migration, preventing terrorism that could affect Europe.
And on the other side, China and Russia, they have their own aid strategies to build their own networks.
They do, although Russia's capacity is more limited. China's Belt and Road is explicitly designed to build this vast network of economic and political partners over 140 countries now, I think across Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, securing trade routes and resources. Russia tends to use more targeted aid, like to Syria or Venezuela, mainly to maintain specific strategic footholds where it can.
And we also see countries like, say, India or Brazil using aid a bit differently, not quite fitting into those big blocks.
Yes, that's a good point. Countries like India and Brazil do provide aid, often to their neighbors or maybe countries in Africa. But their focus seems more geared towards asserting regional leadership and building what's called South-South cooperation. They're not necessarily aligning fully with the big Western or Eastern blocs.
So why do these alliances, often cemented by aid, matter so much from the donor's point of view? What's the core logic?
It really boils down to fundamental interests. Security? First off, aid can underpin mutual defense pacts or help stabilize regions that could pose a security threat. Economic interests are key donors naturally prioritize countries that offer access to markets or vital resources. And then there's ideological alignment reinforcing shared values, whether that's promoting democracy through Western aid or emphasizing state sovereignty and non-interference, which is often part of China's narrative.
But you're saying ideology isn't always the main driver.
Well, the sources suggest that while ideology is definitely a factor, often pure pragmatism, hard security calculations, trade benefits, gaining influence tends to be the stronger force driving these aid-related alliances.
So looking ahead, based on these trends, what kind of future benefits are donors hoping to get from these alliances they're building, partly through aid?
For Western countries, the hope is generally for stronger collective security, like through NATO, reduced global instability, and continued access to global markets. China seems to be aiming for global economic preeminence, securing those critical resources and building a bloc of countries that will support its diplomatic positions internationally. Russia, likely more focused on just maintaining its regional influence where it can, despite economic pressures.
It really sounds like the idea that international relations might just settle down or become less competitive isn't really supported by this picture of aid dynamics.
No, not at all. The sources paint a picture where this great power rivalry, especially between the U.S. and China, is probably going to intensify. And aid is set to remain a primary tool, maybe even a sharper tool in that competition.
That definitely raises a huge question. What does all this mean for the future of international relations and the role aid will play in it?
Well, as we just touched on, the current state is really marked by this significant great power competition, U.S., China, Russia. And their different approaches to aid reflect these tensions, right? The U.S. and EU often link aid to things like governance reforms or security cooperation. China tends to emphasize economic partnership with the stated principle of non-interference in domestic politics.
And current global conflicts, obviously Ukraine, but also situations involving Israel and Gaza, they must be heavily impacting where aid flows and why.
Absolutely. U.S. aid to Ukraine is a direct geopolitical response to counter Russia. And the let's say, varied international aid responses in the context of the conflict involving Israel and Gaza. That also highlights the different strategic priorities and alliances among donor countries. It's very complex.
Beyond the competition, though, these big global challenges, climate change, pandemics, they seem to be shifting aid priorities too.
Yes, significantly. These are issues that don't respect borders, right? So they're increasingly driving aid towards areas like funding green energy projects, helping countries adapt to climate impacts, strengthening public health systems globally. There's a growing recognition that these are shared vulnerabilities.
Looking further ahead then, what future pathways did the sources suggest? Where might international aid and relations be heading?
Increased competition is definitely a major theme running through the analysis. The US-China rivalry is expected to deepen, with both nations likely using aid, maybe more aggressively, to win allies and expand their influence. We could see China push its Belt and Road Initiative further, and maybe the US and its partners try to counter more strongly with their own initiatives.
And the climate change impact on aid will just get bigger.
It seems unavoidable. As climate crises bite harder, a larger chunk of aid will probably have to be redirected towards helping vulnerable nations adapt, transition their energy systems, build resilience. There's also this growing concern highlighted in the sources about potential debt traps.
Right. The idea that some loans, particularly some large infrastructure loans, maybe from China, could end up overwhelming recipient countries.
Exactly. That the debt burden could become unsustainable, potentially destabilizing those countries and having wider ripple effects on global stability. It's a serious concern being discussed.
What about the way aid is delivered? Does the choice between sending it directly from one country to another bilateral versus going through big organizations like the UN or World Bank multilateral, how does that play into the future?
That's an ongoing tension. The sources suggest donors will keep weighing these options. Bilateral aid gives the donor more direct control, more visibility, which is useful for specific strategic goals. Multilateral aid, through the big institutions, can offer greater legitimacy. It can pool resources more effectively, maybe reduce admin costs, but donors have less direct say over exactly where every dollar goes.
So donors might shift their preference.
Yeah, we might see shifts depending on whether direct control or that broader legitimacy is the higher priority for them in a particular situation or for a particular goal.
It's definitely clear this isn't a simple story of rich countries helping poor countries. It's this incredibly complex web of interests, goals, history.
That really is the core takeaway, isn't it? International aid is a sophisticated instrument of foreign policy. It reflects the strategic priorities, the economic goals of donor countries and organizations, operating alongside, and sometimes in tension with, genuine humanitarian impulses.
Okay, let's take a moment then just to explicitly tackle some of the common misconceptions about international aid that our sources point out. Let's clear the air on those.
Sounds good. Well, the big one, as we've kind of circled around, is the idea that aid is always purely altruistic. The sources are very clear. While humanitarian motives are real and present, aid is predominantly driven by strategic, economic, and security objectives.
Right, and the idea that aid automatically benefits all recipient countries equally, that it just lands there and does good everywhere.
That's another major misconception. The reality, according to the evidence, is that the impact of aid depends heavily on the conditions inside the recipient country. Things like the quality of governance, levels of corruption, internal stability. These factors massively influence whether aid is effective or not. Poor governance can just soak up aid with little result.
Does aid always lead to economic growth for the recipient? Is it an automatic engine for development?
Not automatically, no. The studies show pretty mixed results. Aid seems to be most effective and more likely to contribute positively to growth when you have strong institutions in place, good supporting policies, and when the aid is focused on sustainable areas like education, health, maybe basic infrastructure. The sources mention that while many studies find positive effects overall, those challenges like corruption or weak governance keep coming up as major hurdles.
Okay. And finally, this idea that maybe most countries in the world give aid. Is that true?
No, that's definitely incorrect. Providing significant international aid is concentrated among a relatively small group of countries and organizations. We're talking maybe 30 to 40 countries, and a few major international bodies are the primary global donors. And within that group, the US, the EU member states combined, and China account for the lion's share.
It's interesting, the sources even seem to touch upon what an ideal, maybe more effective approach to aid might look like, almost framed from a very objective, data-driven perspective.
Yeah, they do suggest that if you wanted to really optimize aid, the focus would have to be squarely on maximizing effectiveness and transparency. That would mean needing a much more heavily data-driven approach to decide where aid goes, really analyzing the specific needs, carefully assessing the governance quality and potential recipients, trying to estimate the potential impact beforehand. Basically, ensuring resources actually achieve their intended goals and aren't wasted or diverted.
And maybe having some neutrality in the process.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of acting as more of a neutral mediator between donors and recipients comes up. This could help align aid better with the genuine priorities and needs of the local population, rather than just donor interests, and maybe reduce the risk of creating dependency or having aid misaligned with local realities.
Transparency seems key too.
Crucial. Advocating for transparent public reporting of all aid flows, where it comes from, where it goes, what it achieves, that would be vital to help prevent misuse and build public trust, both in donor and recipient countries.
And focusing on long-term sustainability.
Absolutely. Prioritizing aid for things that build long-term capacity education, healthcare systems, sustainable infrastructure like green energy, that's seen as vital for creating lasting positive change, rather than just providing temporary relief or serving short-term donor agendas. The ultimate goal, it seems, would be to find a better balance between achieving genuine humanitarian impact and navigating the unavoidable strategic realities that drive so much donor behavior.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean? We've taken quite a deep dive here into the world of countries and the really complex dynamics of international aid. We started with that surprisingly tricky question of just how many countries there are, and we traced how aid has evolved from an instrument of colonial power to this very sophisticated geopolitical tool it is today.
Yeah, and we've identified the key players on the stage now, the US, European nations, China, others, and seen how their aid decisions are really driven by this complex blend of strategic interests, economic goals, genuine humanitarian concerns, but also the desire for influence and security, and how this often reinforces global alliances, but also global rivalries.
And importantly, we've tackled some of those persistent myths. We've gotten beyond the simplistic idea that aid is always just charity to understand its many different purposes and the very varied, sometimes quite challenging impacts it can actually have on recipient nations, often depending heavily on the local context and governance.
The sources, taken together, really show us that the future of international relations is likely going to continue to be shaped by intense great power competition. Aid looks set to remain a crucial tool in that competition, even while massive global challenges, especially climate change, increasingly demand resources and shift global priorities.
Hopefully this deep dive helps you, our listener, see the layers beneath the headlines. To understand that these global interactions, the flow of resources around the world, they're deeply shaped by history, by national self-interest, but also by genuinely evolving global priorities and challenges. So let's leave you with a final provocative thought to consider. Given all this historical evidence showing how often aid is tied to donor strategic interests, and given the mixed track record when it comes to actual recipient development, how can the global community realistically work towards a future where international aid genuinely empowers recipient nations, helps them reduce dependency, rather than primarily serving the geopolitical chess game of the donors? Something to think about.